Intermediate mode was introduced in May 2024. It was the first actual reworked mode using the new game mode system from Lunar Overture that is an easy mode because nobody cares about easy mode frankly. This mode is horrible and it was always horrible from the start, and I think a lot of it isn't strictly from it being the first mode they made. For this video I made this around the time Fallen got its mini rework, so I will reference both versions of Fallen. Intermediate mode waves lack an identity, and at its worst, it's just straight up spamming enemies. The current set of intermediate mode enemies get burned through the first 20 waves. Multiple notable enemies are introduced on the same wave, and for stuff like Necromancer and Speedy Boss, they already spawn with slime and health regen. Enraged spawn with slimes, Reavers spawn with Necromancers, Failed Experiments spawn with hidden bosses, and there's basically no build up for anything. Speedy Bosses don't really have a place either, because it's just a weaker version of Failed Experiment that spawns 2 waves earlier. This doesn't really happen with Molten or Fallen. The only outlier is wave 24 on Molten mode, where it introduces 1 new enemy and 2 stronger variants of enemies, and even then the waves don't have the same spam issue as Intermediate. This leads to Intermediate waves feeling really rushed and makes the last 10 waves just the same few enemies spammed over and over. Molten and Fallen have even less waves of nothing happening, plus additional mini bosses. In my opinion, Modifier spam is more of an enemy variety issue rather than anything related to difficulty. If we didn't have bloated Modifier, we would just have even more stronger variants of enemies in the waves instead. In my opinion, you could go pretty far with Intermediate's current set of enemies. You don't really need to make new enemies or take them from other modes like Polluted. Just reconfigure your stats if you're going to make them spawn early or later, then that's about it. With Casual now being the stepping stone between Easy and Intermediate, you could now do a lot more with Intermediate and make it more similar to Molten and Fallen, such as adding Boomers as Intermediate does introduce debuffs, and maybe Giant Boss from Fallen mode as a mini-boss or a Fallen Guard equivalent, considering it's implied he created them also. With these changes, I think Intermediate would be a lot more interesting and it would have a lot of the waves speaking for themselves rather than just a blur. Intermediate mode has 3 different modifiers, with 1 being exclusive and 2 basically being exclusive because of how rare they are. Health regen is pretty obvious, but I do feel like it being introduced in Intermediate and only really being in other modes in the late game is kinda weird, especially for being such a generic attribute, which kinda got fixed with Corrupted Fallens getting health regen in the mini rework, but still. Slime is basically another enemy type rather than an attribute. They spawn as a different enemy, and when they get killed, they get revealed, kinda like a reverse mystery. And if you don't kill them in time, they reappear as the strongest enemy on the map at full health. This attribute is oddly punishing for Intermediate mode, and yet doesn't really do much. If a slime transforms and you didn't really bring anything like Trapper or Military Base, you are basically dead. But you have to let a slime transform, mainly with Pyromancer or Wave 25 being horribly designed. It just doesn't really feel that intuitive, especially when it's spammed to hell and back in a late game Intermediate, so in practice it just acts like another 100 HP. Bloated is literally right there if you want to increase health. I think something like making the transformed enemy be on low health based on how much health the slime had right before it transformed would make it a lot less punishing. It also allows you to increase the health of the slime without it becoming a paradox. Another thing is that I think the health of the slime should be based on what enemy it came from, kinda like how Molten Corpse works. Failed Experiment would spawn a huge slime, but something like Hazmat would spawn a small slime. Corpse appears on a lot of enemies too, but Molten Titan still has that I should change up my strategy factor to it, which Failed Experiment doesn't really have, even though both are kinda meant to be the same enemy. One small thing also would be to give slime enemies a green tint to add a visual indicator and to give off the idea that the slime is actually taking the form of an enemy. Tank attribute deserves its own segment because of how stupid it is. It is genuinely such a horribly designed attribute, and there's a reason it doesn't appear post-Intermediate mode, which also makes it even more stupid arguably, which I'm gonna save for the end. The towers in the namesake category are in a really weird and unbalanced state. There's stuff like Intermediate mode being released around the tail end of Shotgunner outclassing every early game tower. Here's a list of Intermediate tower buffs compared to the 1 Intermediate mode change. Rocketeer is a really good tower and it can out DPS other DPS towers when it comes to stuff like Fallen King and defense enemies in general. It was also bugged and did around half the intended damage, and it was still really good. Militant buff is weird because he's the poster boy for Intermediate intermediate towers. You buffed his DPS by 50% and made him even more cost effective when you balanced the namesake mode around spamming militant when he did around 50 DPS. What I'm saying is that a lot of intermediate towers are having this really noticeable power creep. It doesn't help that a lot of them are basically able to do early game, mid game, and late game instead of focusing on a specific part. This leads to stuff like Shotgunner and Pyro, and stuff like the higher tier starter towers like Demo and Hunter to be left in the dust. You can literally be in Molten mode with Militant and Military Base, which was the loadout you were intended to use on Intermediate. A simple fix is to just not have buffed all the intermediate towers so much. I think also having them have a specific niche in each phase of the game would help. Military Base does practically nothing until level 3 and you're able to place it on wave 1 for £400. When you get it to level 4 it's really good for just 10k. Airstrikes carry mid-game bosses and a well-timed airstrike pretty much nullifies most hard waves, and you're just gonna make those £500 back regardless of how you use it. Why even have it be able to be placed in the early game in the first place when it's very clearly a mid-game hard carry tower? I'm not that good with balancing, so I'm not gonna get into specifics, and there's also stuff like Trapper which got nerfed recently and now other traps are more worth using. Tank is the worst designed attribute in TDS history. It makes all damage from all sources besides collision be reduced to 1 damage. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Before the rebalance, it was exclusive to Reavers, but after the rebalance we have the stats we know and acknowledge today, and it was moved onto Slows and Enraged. Tank only really works when the enemy itself is balanced around it, like old Reavers. You wouldn't give random enemies tank attribute, it just wouldn't make sense at all. In practice, tank is just a terribly designed attribute with zero counterplay regardless of what you do. It's just what I said before makes it sting a bit less. You could try giving it counterplay by making it so explosions bypass it, but at the same time you could just use defense. Same concept but less punishing and actually well designed, which is what they did when they rebalanced Reavers and then for Bulwarks in the Molten rework. The only times tank was used was in weekly challenges, although to be fair they just slap random mods onto enemies and call it a day, and for iframes for phase 2 Molten Warlord and Titus paired with aggro, also which I think is a decent use for them, and it kinda actually synergizes with tank attribute well. Tank modifier quite literally makes intermediate harder than other modes. For this experiment I'm going to use level 2 Hunter which does 14 damage. Wave 10 has 2 tank bloated slows. 1 tank bloated slow is equal to about 560 health with this experiment, and there's 2 of them. Wave 10 intermediate is equal to 1320 health if you include the hiddens. Wave 10 molten is equal to 550 health. Wave 13, which is similar enough, has 900 health. Old Fallen Wave 10 is equal to about 620 total health. Intermediate Wave 10 quite literally has more health than the other modes. Alright, fine. You could make the argument that I used the wrong tower and that I should have used Militant or something. If the tower I brought did as much as 5 damage, then it would have made Intermediate have 600 health, which is still more health than the other modes. Another case with tank attribute being used is Wave 25, which has 3 tank enraged first thing. They immediately rushed through my defenses and I leaked 100 base health and died. I had another attempt where I leaked them and survived because I accidentally turned on skill tree, and I still died because the 5 slimes turned into failed experiments and hidden bosses. I couldn't do anything to prevent both of those deaths. Wave 27 on Molten is a similar concept to Wave 25, with faster enemies and fast bosses. I killed the Molten Hounds and almost killed the Molten Mechs, not to mention I had a lot more eco which allowed me to get more max hunters and demomen. I'm not going to go into too much because it's the same point, and additionally, these waves are pretty much a direct counter to my strategy as it's a stunner and fast fire rate check. It's still wild how I basically had a better time with Molten mode than Intermediate mode. Tank modifier makes the difficulty spikes of Intermediate way harder than they need to. Straight up removing tank modifier would do wonders for Intermediate and make it actually playable for once, and it also just adds to my point that Intermediate was balanced around militant spam, and that's all the testing they did. As a conclusion, I think most of these solutions boil down to the fact casual mode now exists, and can now be used as a bridge between easy and intermediate. You can make intermediate just as unique as Molten and Fallen without it feeling awkward or too much of a difficulty spike, because you now have casual mode as a baseline. That was kind of the point of casual mode, but they didn't really do that. I think it was also implied that casual mode would be temporary while they balanced Molten and Fallen and intermediate, which they didn't really do. And with the fact casual mode was just a reskinned intermediate and even had Patient Zero as the boss, kinda adds to it. Intermediate mode is a horrible mode with horrible mechanics that's already outdated as hell. Like and subscribe if you want to see me talk about more dumb stuff in Roblox tower defense games. I will see you later. Bye. Please like and subscribe, I need this.